Nico, this book couldn't come at a better time. We are looking at quite a fraught era for trans youth and their families and the LGBTQ community generally. What was your initial inspiration for writing American Teenager?
Well, to be honest, I wanted to stop this from happening. Really, this book was written to warn people about the dangers of another Trump presidency. The last time he was in office, his administration was responsible for more than 200 attacks on LGBTQ plus people. The community already withstood one Trump administration, and it's going to be really difficult to do it again. And to me, this book was a warning. It was a warning to Americans about what trans youth would be forced to go through and withstand if they were forced to do another 4 years of this horrible man. And really, for me, this work started in 2021. A mom in Texas called me because her state had introduced a bill that would brand parents of trans kids as child abusers if they allowed their kids to transition. And I think before that, I'd always operated under this naive assumption that we were all engaging in good faith here in the conversation, that we all wanted what was best for trans kids, right? And we all wanted them to grow up well, and maybe we had a difference of opinion on what that looks like. So for me as a journalist, I always thought, okay, well, people on the other side are operating with bad information, and I just need to replace that bad information with good information. But for me now, I just see how much work needs to be done. Like, I see like how long the fight's gonna be, and I see how many books like this need to be written. To me, like, this book is really just a start. There's so much more education work that needs to be done, and we really, really, really need to double down on that in the next 4 years to make sure we don't make this same mistake over again.
So this book is an honest rendering of the challenges ahead, but it's also a collective story about resilience and survival and finding, not just that bottom line just to get by, but really finding a pathway to thrive for trans youth, right? That's what I love most about it.
I think that looks really different for different kids, right? Like what surviving and what thriving looks like. It often depends on what state you're in. It depends on the kind of privileges you have. It depends on like family support. But so many of these kids, I'm so inspired by the ways in which they just continue to persist even through all this. They continue to find ways to keep going and to lead lovely lives in spite of everything. Like Ruby, I think, is such a good example in that like her family has been such a light her entire life. They'd already started doing the work of educating themselves about trans people before she ever came out, because they knew that one day that might be a possibility. They didn't sort of know it was up, but they had like an inkling that maybe that might be down the road. And if that day did come, they wanted to be ready. They wanted to be already educated. And when she came out at her church, she had a coming out party. They threw her what's called like a renaming liturgy, where you get to, in a sense, like discard your old name in like favor of the person that you're becoming. And I was lucky enough to get to document her, would you call it your first real relationship?
Yes.
Yeah, her sort of first real relationship, that happened sort of by accident. I'd been in Texas just a couple days, and she gets asked out by the boy that she likes. And I loved getting to be there for that, because I think it's the kind of moment that trans kids get to have all the time, of like falling in love, of being loved and giving love in return, but they rarely get to see themselves portrayed that way. They rarely get to like talk about their own joy, to talk about the things that are keeping them going. So being able to center that in this book was just such a gift. And I think that we all really need to hear it right now, because I think so many people are figuring out, what does joy look like to me right now? What does survival look like to me right now? And we just need to do as best we can to lift each other up.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's beautifully said. Ruby, we're both from the great state of Texas, and I think we're both proud to be from Texas in spite of everything, in spite of all the challenges. Your chapter in this book is gorgeous, empowering, really a great testament, and I would say an example for not just trans youth, but really youth generally, on how to get through some hard times and persevere, and also stay within your authenticity, which is extremely difficult for any young person. What do you hope folks take away from the chapter about you?
The chapter was kind of an example of what life for trans kids could be like, or should be like more often. And so I think that, it's really, I want people to take away that trans people can be joyful. I think that there's a misconception about trans people, at least through my experience, that people kind of expect us to be these like fragile little baby birds. And, you know, joy can be found by anybody, and joy is resistance and joy, mostly. Yeah.
Well, you know, there are a lot of trans youth in this country who have a wide range of support systems. Some of them have no support system at all. You have a support system that you so richly deserve, and that I wish every young trans person had. What do you hope that trans youth who may not have that support system get from reading about your story?
I think not to lose hope. Even if you don't currently have those supports or that support system, I think that it's important to remember that there are people like you, and there are people out there who want to support you and who want to be there for you. Growing up, my family and my church was always very supportive, but the isolation of not being around other trans people was really difficult for me. So I think to other trans people, and maybe to my younger self, maybe tell them that there are people like you, and that support network is out there.
It's a funny thing. I feel like even now, with more trans visibility than ever, you know, the less kind factions of American politics will look at trans youth and say that they are being manipulated into a certain decision to come out, which is funny to me, because when I look at the landscape, even with this unprecedented trans representation, trans youth still don't have many examples in public life to look to.
No, no, yeah. Well, that was what made it difficult for me, partly, to come out, was the lack of trans visibility. Or they really delve very deep into it in that documentary, Disclosure, that trans women were viewed as punchlines, essentially. And so I was having all these feelings and all these thoughts about, you know, I was realizing that I was a woman, and I just felt like, are people going to think of me as a joke? People going to think of me as a punchline? Or, because there's that whole, like, again, they talk about it in the documentary, but that whole thing of a man dressing in woman's clothes and, oh, look at how funny. It's like seeing people in the media who look like you and are going through similar life experiences as you is extremely important. And yeah, that's what made it difficult for me to come out, was that lack of positive trans representation. But thankfully that's changing.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I grew up in the 90s, and if you go back and look at any 90s TV show, a lot of 90s movies, but certainly any 90s TV show, at some point during the course of their run, transphobia makes an appearance. Yeah. Every single one. You know, it's interesting to see how fast things have changed, and yet you're right, we still don't have enough positive representation. Mm-hmm. I want to see trans characters who, you know, certainly have their challenges, but are living very full and rich lives. That's what I want to see, you know, whether it's a trans hero or a trans villain, but trans people who can stand on their own 2 feet and are seen as an equal weight in any story. I think that's what trans youth need to see, is that we're all complicated just like anyone else, but, you know, at least we're fully imagined and fully real.
That was one of the contributing factors that made it difficult for me to come out, was the depiction of, especially trans women in media, was that they were either very tragic or punchlines, or viewed as like gross. Like that trans women were, that they were just viewed as gross, and that who they are and what they wanted was wrong, because they wanted to step outside of the box. But that's why I was, you know, so happy to be in the book, because I think we have to counteract that message, those messages.
There are really no filler stories in here, in your book, Nico. I mean, Ruby's story is one of many that do have that richness and fullness, and I would say authentic messiness that we should see in any healthy young adult. when you look at the wide range of trans folks in this country, and especially trans youth, how did you come to choose the locations that you did to explore trans youth and their families and their experiences?
For me, it was always about less the location than finding stories that I was really interested in and families that I just really connected with. Because, first and foremost, I wanted to write a good book. And I knew that if I, as the writer, weren't incredibly engaged with all my subjects, the reader would be able to tell, right? And I think that as a journalist, readers can generally tell when I'm phoning it in a little bit. And in this book, I didn't want you to read a single chapter and think, wow, Nico really phoned this one in. I wanted it to feel like you were really, like I was really connecting with my subjects, so that way you, as the reader, would really connect with my subjects. So, for all of the families, I think, Ruby's family is a really good example. We just got each other right away. And all of the families, I could just tell right away that there was something really special there, that there was a story that needed to be told, that I was the right person to tell it, and that we just needed to be in each other's lives. And there were, of course, certain states that felt really important to me to highlight. Those two really were Texas and then Florida, because I just feel like you can't understand what it's like to be a trans kid in America right now without understanding what trans kids in Texas and Florida have been through. Because it's a real trauma that you have to go through every year when legislative session comes around, because you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if this could be the year where you're forced to move, if this could be the year where your rights are stripped away. Nobody should have to go through this, but also a 17-year-old especially shouldn't have to go through this. Think about what it was like to be 17. It was already difficult. Being a kid is really hard. And then you throw all that on top of this. And it's so devastating. And there's so many kids across the country who are dealing with versions of this right now. And it just shouldn't be this hard. And I hope that this book explains to people why that is, how hard it is, and helps give them a vision for what we need to do to stop it.
This is exceptional embedded journalism. When I was reading the book, it reminded me of this book published in the mid-90s called A Hope in the Unseen. Michael Lewis. He wrote the book about a young black man growing up in an area of the country that just wasn't so great. No one really had the resources to do what they needed to do. The teachers didn't have the resources to teach these kids. And yet this young man persevered through all of it, even with all the challenges, got accepted to Harvard or Yale, one of the two, Ivy League school, went there, and then kept struggling. Because even when you get up that ladder a little bit, you're going to find challenges that your peers who do not have the previous challenges experience. And there's something in this book that I think takes that and amplifies it to such a beautiful extent. Because your message here is not that simply coming out into a supportive family or simply being in an area of the country where there might be protections is the key here. Really, it's about the support system overall, of society, of community, of family, of neighbors. It's really everyone working toward that same goal of ensuring that no young person, regardless of their gender identity, gets left behind.
Yeah, beautifully put. I will say, not to devil's advocate that at all, but something I keep coming back to and thinking about a lot is that in the book, you see these layers of privilege that kids have. Some kids are really struggling because they just don't have, they live in states where they don't have protections. They live in communities that aren't that supportive. They're, educating their schools, they're educating their families. It's just a lot of work that they're doing all the time, a lot of work of existing that they're doing, right? But then you have other families that seem to have so much going for them. Ruby's family is a really good example of this. Ruby in the book was so aspirational to me because she was just kind of this person who seemed to really have everything going for her. She's got this great family, an amazing grandmother, this awesome house, this kick-ass brother. She's got this cool boyfriend. She has these neat interests. She has visions and dreams and goals for herself. Her church supports her. Her mom loves her. She just really has it all. And I was so enamored of that and so happy for you. I was so happy that you got to have that life. But it really broke my heart that somebody who had as much going on for her as Ruby did, so many people in her corner, she still couldn't be trans in Texas at the end of all that, because policy is important, right? The kinds of laws that your state is passing that either make it possible for you to exist or take away your ability to exist are important. So even with all of that, with everything going right for you, you still had to make the decision to move, to leave, to get out, to go somewhere where the laws and policies are on your side. Because I think, as you said, like, it's really hard to envision a future for yourself in a state that won't let you have a future. Mm-hmm. So, you know, when people read this book and they read about Ruby and sort of everything that she's been through, I hope they really take that to heart. You know, as we look to the next 4 years of the Trump administration and the kinds of anti-LGBTQ plus policies that are going to be enacted against kids across the country, I think of all the privileged kids that are going to realize that privilege isn't enough. You know, you can have all the privilege in the world, but if your own government is trying to eradicate you, that's kind of it. That's in a way the last word. And it just breaks my heart. It's been so hard the past couple weeks, or the past week rather, to hear from so many of the families I worked with on this book, and to hear so many families across the country who are making the really difficult decision right now of whether they want to stay in America or not, whether they even can stay in America, right? You know, if this country has a future for them. You know, these families have fought so hard to be here. I fought so hard by writing this book for these families to be here. And it breaks my heart that this is where we are. It shouldn't be like this.
No, I get emails from parents of trans kids, complete strangers, never met them, because they are so desperate for any sort of guidance right now. And they are reaching out to everyone they can because the most important thing in their life is their kid. And they're at the point where they don't see any life rafts anywhere, because we are living through a moment in which so many folks are acting in exceedingly bad faith to target vulnerable people, not because it's based on any sort of logic or merit of argument, but because they just simply want to exploit hatred and bigotry for their own ends, which is the most shameless and soulless reason for doing anything. It's really tragic. But you know what? The way you wrote about Ruby and, you know, a lot of these other young people, they do live in these states with hostile state governments and hostile lawmakers, but then you also see the cultures within these areas and within these communities from people who may not necessarily know trans identities very well, or may not know the right questions to ask, but they do lead with empathy. They want to do the right thing as a person. I talked to a lot of reporters in the mainstream reporters who ask questions about trans identities, and they're always shocked to find out that most trans people live in the South and Midwest. They always assume that it's either New York or LA where most trans people in the country live, and it's not. And yes, you know, a lot of trans people don't have the privilege to be able to move out of state, right? That is a privilege to be able to do that. But a lot of trans folks do. And they still stay in their communities because they do have a love for the people around them. The people around them, even if they don't necessarily understand gender identity, they still recognize their humanity. And I think that gets lost so often in what a lot of the mainstream press talks about when they do discuss trans issues. Would you agree?
Yeah, well, I think that there are a lot of components here. There are people who have the privilege to move and choose not to, but then there are so many families that don't have the privilege to at all. Like, moving is really expensive. And this is something I've been writing about pretty consistently over the past few years, is that there's this media narrative that everybody's just gonna leave, right? Like, that we're all just gonna get out of Dodge and, you know, and that's just it. Every parent I've ever known is really cash strapped. And then suddenly you have to come up with all of this money to leave your state or potentially leave the country. And a lot of families are already really struggling to get by. And we don't tell those stories nearly enough. We don't tell the stories of people who stay. We don't tell the stories of people who just have a different life or a different narrative than the kind that we've heard over and over again. Because I think as we learn, over and over again, the trans community isn't a monolith. There are so many people who are struggling with what's happening right now in wildly disparate ways. And we need to carve out so much space to tell all of those kinds of stories, because people need to feel heard right now. You know, they need to feel like their voices matter, because they're in this moment where it feels like they don't. It feels so disempowering to be in this moment right now. But I want us to have our power back. I believe that we can. I think it just takes a lot of work.
That's really well said. It seems like a lot of folks, well, you know, I'll be honest with you, when I look at all the anti-trans arguments out there, whether it's gender-affirming care or trans people in the military or trans kids in sports, everything, really. And when you go point by point with these folks in good faith and you very respectfully and peacefully identify the gaps in logic behind their concern, you realize very quickly that it wasn't about science. It wasn't about, I would say, concern for youth. It wasn't about really anything other than a very central, immovable discomfort they have with trans people. That's what it seems to come down to at the end of the day. And has that been your experience as you've, you know, not only navigated as a non-binary journalist through all this, but also all these communities across the country?
You know, it's been interesting. I had this fear that when I started this book tour, that I was going to get a lot of jerks, you know, that people were going to come to like your book tour stops and heckle you and that sort of thing. People have been willing to learn, like willing to be educated. And I haven't had too many like dumb, like jerky questions so far. But there's one that really stuck out to me. There was this this dad that came up with his trans kids. And I thought that was really interesting that he would then ask me this kind of question, because he sort of took me aside and he wanted to know. He was like, hey, so what do you think about, you know, these 13-year-old kids getting like irreversible surgeries? And I told him, well, I don't really have to have an opinion on that because it's not happening. Like, I don't have to have an opinion on like a fictional hypothetical because that's just not the reality. And you know, I think I was pretty nice about it, but I asked him, you know, what led him to ask that question? You know, what was going on? Like, what are you thinking about here? Because I just was curious about what was motivating, you know, this concern. And, you know, he talked about just his fear for kids, and, you know, not wanting them to make, you know, the wrong decision and all this stuff, really just sort of his own hang-ups and anxieties here. And we just talked through it for a while. We just sort of sat with each other, right? And I just sort of like asked him more and more, almost like playing therapist, you tell me about this anxiety, where is it coming from? And at the end of the conversation, what he was able to realize, and what I sort of also impressed as well, was that we both wanted the same things for these kids. We wanted them to grow up well. We wanted them to be happy and healthy and to make the best decisions for themselves and to be empowered to make those decisions, to not have people take choices away from them, right? We wanted them to have all the choices in the world and to have these like bright, beautiful futures. And when we were able to listen to each other and get past these like preconceived notions that he had, he realized that we were on the same side here, that we just want these kids to be happy. And I think that that's what more of us need to do. And I don't really look at, you know, as LGBTQ plus folks as being like the problem here, but I think it's just a matter of people on the other side of this need to realize that like no one is the enemy here. We all want the same thing. You know, we all want what's best for these kids. And I don't know how we've gotten away from that, right? That we've become so good at thinking the worst of people immediately, at thinking the worst of like loving parents who just want to support their kids, who just want their kids to like grow up well, to have all the opportunities they didn't get to have. I don't know what it takes to get us there, right? To that space of good faith. I wrote this book, I think, in hopes that we would get there one day. But I also then hoped that America wouldn't re-elect Donald Trump, so apparently what do I know? But I do believe that we can. You know, I believe it's possible to get out of this like vicious cycle that we seem to be trapped in as a country, where we're all just like taught to hate each other, right? Like, that's not what these kids need. It's not a world that like the next generations need to grow up in. I want a world of joy. That's why this book centers joy. Because if we don't start creating it, if we don't start privileging it, I don't think we'll ever get there. And we need to get there sooner rather than later.
Yeah, there needs to be an infrastructure of joy in the movement, certainly. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I I was thinking the other day, the Washington Post reported that the Trump campaign dropped something in the neighborhood of $215 million on anti-trans ads in the final sprint of this election. And I thought about all these trans youth who were watching the World Series this past month, and NCAA games and NFL games, all the sports events. These are the ones during which these ads air. And I kept thinking about those kids and their families sitting beside them and wondering what they were thinking as they saw this. Ruby, what would be your advice to a trans youth who has just gotten through an absolutely brutal election cycle even before Election Day and might be feeling quite insecure about their place in the country? It's a big question, I know.
I know. Well, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer it.
Yeah.
Because I'm one of those kids, I suppose. I'm not sure if I fit in here. I don't know how we move forward from here, because I never thought that we would be at this point. We talk about it in the book. I was going to, because there's a lot of anti-trans legislation in Texas, and I was going to move to California, but with the recent election, we've decided that that's not far enough. So I'll be moving to Europe as soon as I can. But I'm finding the things that bring me joy, and then I try to do them as much as I can. Because I really think joy now is resistance. Joy, authenticity, identity, I think, is resistance in an era where marginalization, marginalized groups are being made into some form of boogeyman, or misinformation and misconceptions are being spread about us. And I don't know, I'm living my life.
But I have to say, I don't know if I told you this, but honestly, something that's been giving me hope through all this is seeing you just be a young person and having fun. Because one of the things that I really stress with the kids that I worked with in this book, because we've sort of all kept in touch, right? Their parents text me all the time, they text me all the time, because we're friends now, we're like family, right? And something I often try to impress on the kids in this book is that they should be young and dumb for as long as they can, to have just silly kid experiences, that one day they'll regret not giving to themselves later if they don't do them. When you're so focused on going to the legislature all the time and begging for your right to be seen as a person, right? You don't always have time to think about yourself as just being a kid, like other kids. You don't have the time to give yourself kid experiences. And I know so many of the kids in the book struggle with that. I think you've struggled with that in a way. So just seeing you enjoy being young and free and just living your best life, going out to the club, and living in the gay part of town. I think that that's so wonderful. That feels so self-protective to me. That to me right now, that's the best form of self-care I think you can give yourself.
Well, I don't think I have a choice for myself but to do that, because I did do some advocacy work with my mom, and I'm very happy that I did that, because I felt an obligation to the trans movement and to other trans people, other queer people, to fight for us. But to listen to the legislators talk about my body and to talk about children's body for hours and to just degrade us it was very difficult for me. And I choose joy because I have to, basically. Because in Texas, I choose joy because I have to. That's how I have to live my life.
I wish trans youth generally knew how much seeds they're planting right now for so many trans youth to come after decades in the future. You and I can sit here specifically because of queer activists in the 60s, 70s, 80s who fought for equality that they probably knew they wouldn't live to enjoy. In a way, trans youth, just by existing and persevering and surviving, are creating that future world. It's a huge burden that no one should have to bear, but it's quite inspirational.
I'm in a very fortunate position, again, because of previous activists, where I don't really have to think about it. I'm just being myself and living my life. But I think if I was a kid and I saw, like if younger me could see me now, I'd be like, oh my gosh, she's so cool. So like if I can provide that for someone else, I think that would be my goal, especially through this project.
Well, I was thinking about that earlier, actually, when you were talking about trans representation. Mm-hmm. And I think what you were speaking to is not seeing yourself represented in media, yes. Seeing someone who is like you. And I think for you, maybe being in this book, the best way to see someone like you in media is to literally be you in media, yeah. Right? To be that person. Mm. And I don't know, I think that's a lovely gift to give everyone. I don't know if you recognize like what a big gift it was to give to all of us. Because it's a big thing, it's brave. Like to put yourself out there like that. That's like an overused word, brave, but it is. It's like, it's a really courageous act to put yourself out there so vulnerably.
It's an act of leadership.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'm grateful that I was a part of it and to be given that gift to be able to do that.
Honestly, I'm grateful that we like got to know each other, you know? Like being able to be like a little bit part of your family now, mostly because of Mimi, because of your grandma. Really, that's the big reason. But also just like, I don't know, I had such fun with you all. Mm-hmm. And to me, you know, you said it in the book that like trans joy is subversion. Mm-hmm. And I think there was so much joy in just us like sharing space with each other and like having fun while doing this heavy project together. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, it was hard obviously, but I don't know, I think you can tell in the book like how much, I don't know, like how much bliss there was, you know? That it was just like us hanging out and like watching Drag Race.
Yeah, it was a very joyful time in my life.
I think it's like, in a way, I think you taught me how to have joy, like being with you all. Like this is so weird, but I think about this thing you do all the time, that whenever Ruby senses something isn't that important or isn't really that big of a deal, she'll say, what are they gonna do, arrest me for smoking? Which is like, it's a reference to Basic Instinct, this movie in the 90s that if you're, you know, under 18, you should not be watching. But it's a very good movie. And it reminds me to not take things so seriously all the time, you know, that sometimes things are just okay, right? And we can just be in space and we can just enjoy ourselves. Like, I think you taught me how to enjoy myself more. Like, I don't think I really knew how to do that until I wrote this book and just getting to be there with all of you. It was a really big gift you guys all gave me, so.
Oh, well, that's very important, again, as trans people. We choose joy because we have to.
This is an exceptional book, and it was a long, it's a journey of such committed journalism. You did extraordinary work with it. Where can people buy it?
So a great way to buy the book is through Alstora. We were their book club pick for October. And they're also an LGBTQ website. They're an LGBTQ online book vendor. So obviously, you know, we want queer people supporting queer people. And if you can't do that, I always stress to people to please support your local indie bookseller. Many cities across the country have their own. I believe there are 1,600 independent booksellers in 50 states across the country. Please, like, shop small, shop local. Like Amazon, bookshop.org is great. The more you can do to just like support people who are really doing the work, the better. Because what I found through doing this tour and through promoting this book is like indie booksellers do so much to really like stand up for like queer authors and to promote queer stories. They're really the ones who are like putting us out there, who are like recommending us to readers, and then making sure that our books stay in the conversation. And I always just want to credit the people who are fighting for us, because I think we as queer people realize how important allies are right now. We don't have nearly enough of them. I think that's what we saw in this election, right? Is that there are so many people who are disengaged from what's happening and what's going on, from like the realities that trans kids are facing. So having people stick up for this book and prioritize this book, put it in the front of their store, recommend it to readers, has really meant the world to me. And I think it means the world to these kids, because it's just like, that's how their stories are going to get out there, when people privilege their voices and decide their voices matter.
Can I tell you what I hope happens with this book?
Yeah.
I hope that it lands on tens of thousands of college syllabi across the country and really outside the country. I feel like it could be in sociology courses, government courses, politics courses. It could be really across a wide range of disciplines. There's so much applicability to opening these specific experiences to folks who are getting their degree, trying to figure out what they want to do in the world, whether it's be a social worker, a politician, a lawyer, a public school teacher. It really does have such a universality to it that I don't want people to overlook. So that would be my recommendation to people watching. Get your college professor, or if you are a college professor, to put this book on your syllabus and create a lesson plan out of it, because there's so much good stuff in here that can be used to teach more about the world, not just trans youth, but really the struggles that trans youth go through that I think are universal themes that everyone can appreciate.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing I've been really heartened by too is that when we were doing outreach for this book to just let people know, all across the country that it exists, I reached out to LGBT groups, I reached out to pride groups, I reached out to like parent organizations, but the people who have been like really surprisingly, like stunningly supportive have been church groups, have been like affirming church groups across the country who like have trans folks and parents of trans kids in their congregations and have wanted to have these kind of conversations for a really long time and just haven't had a tool or a resource to do that. So many families in this book are families of faith. Your family is a family of faith, right? So those families are already a part of their congregations, and they just haven't known, what to do to recognize their experiences and to really like bring them into the church. And this book provides a pathway to do that. So I would say to folks that if you are with an affirming congregation, if you're with like a church that loves and supports and affirms LGBTQ plus people, recommend this to people, recommend this to your pastor, get it as like a book study. So make sure that this, this book is part of the conversation there, because I think it can make a really big impact when we bring books like these into spaces where we don't think that conversation can happen, right? Because we have this idea that all religious people think the same thing about queer folks. And I know that's not true. I know there are so many more allies in this country than we saw in this election. And we just need to find a way to engage them. We need to find a way to bring them into the conversation, to make them feel welcomed. Because I think that there are so many relationships that we can be building. There are so many relationships we can build that can get us out of this mess. And we just need to start doing the work.
I want to second that. This is exactly the kind of book that my church's book club would pick up and discuss in a really meaningful, and I'd say collaborative way. Communities of faith can be so critical to just creating bridges of understanding between people. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I'd love to end on a wonderful note, or at least a very hopeful note. Ruby, when you look at 10 years from now, what's your dream life?
31, okay. I'm married. I have a chic little apartment in Paris. I'd like to work in a museum or art gallery, but mostly I'd like to have a large group of friends in Paris, and I'd like to be extremely fashionable. I think those are the main things. But I would love to kind of earn some kind of esteem in an art career, museum career.
Feels like you're not really asking for much here.
No. Am I asking for the stars here? I don't think so.
No, you're not. Well, thank you both so much. It's been an honor to chat with you today. I love this book, and I hope a lot of folks read it who desperately need to read it in this moment.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah.